In Module 4.1, we discussed compensation transparency and the importance of disclosing who is receiving payment in a transaction. We emphasized that if compensation flows, disclosure follows. Now we go one layer deeper. Because compensation does not exist in a vacuum, it is directly connected to agency. And agency determines duty. This module focuses on how disclosure expectations shift, depending on whether you represent the buyer or the seller, and how conflicts must be identified and avoided to maintain fiduciary alignment. This is where compensation and loyalty intersect. Disclosure expectations, depending on role. Your role in a transaction shapes your obligations. When you represent a seller, your fiduciary duty runs to that seller. You must promote their best interests, maintain confidentiality, and negotiate favorable terms. When you represent a buyer, your duty shifts entirely. You must advocate for price, terms, and disclosures that benefit the buyer. Compensation does not change that duty. But compensation can complicate perception. Let's explore this with a practical example. Scenario 1. Buyer representation. You represent a buyer. The listing broker is offering cooperative compensation. You are paid from that compensation at closing. That is common practice. But your buyer should understand how you are being compensated and that your fiduciary duty remains fully aligned with them. Now imagine an additional incentive. The listing broker offers a bonus for closing before a certain date. You do not disclose this to your buyer. Even if the bonus is lawful, failure to disclose the incentive could create a perception that your advice was influenced by compensation. Disclosure protects your credibility. Scenario 2. Seller representation. You represent a seller. You agree to split compensation with a cooperating broker. You later agree to pay an additional referral fee from your commission without informing the seller. Even though the seller may not directly pay the referral fee, they may reasonably expect transparency regarding compensation flow tied to their listing. Clarity about your compensation structure reinforces trust. In both scenarios, your role determines your duty determines your disclosure obligation, and your disclosure obligation determines your compliance exposure. Conflict avoidance compensation arrangements can create real or perceived conflicts of interest. Arizona law requires licensees to exercise reasonable care and avoid dishonest dealings. Conflicts do not always arise from misconduct. They often arise from misunderstanding. Consider this scenario. You represent a buyer. A builder offers you an increased commission if you bring your buyer to a particular new home community. If you do not disclose that increased incentive to your buyer, the buyer may later question whether your recommendation was fully objective. Even if you believe the home was a good fit, the undisclosed incentive may create the appearance of bias. Transparency reduces conflict. Now imagine another situation. You represent both buyer and seller in a limited representation arrangement. Compensation is structured differently than in a single agency transaction. If either party does not fully understand how you are being compensated, the perception of divided loyalty increases. Conflict avoidance begins with communication. Modernized compensation rules reinforce that disclosure is not optional when compensation could influence decision-making. Remember from Chapter 1, clarity reduces ambiguity. Clear compensation disclosure reduces conflict. Fiduciary alignment. Let's talk about fiduciary alignment in practical terms. When you accept a client, you accept duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and reasonable care. Compensation must never override those duties. The modernization of compensation disclosure rules reinforces that your fiduciary role does not change based on who pays you. Here is a common misunderstanding. Some buyers assume that if their agent is paid by the seller's broker, the agent must really work for the seller. That is not correct. But if you do not clearly explain compensation flow and your fiduciary obligations, that misunderstanding can grow. Clear communication strengthens fiduciary alignment. Now consider this example. You represent a seller. A buyer's broker requests a commission concession to keep the deal alive. You agree and reduce your commission to make the numbers work. Your fiduciary duty requires that your seller understand how compensation adjustments impact them. Even when you are reducing your own compensation, transparency protects alignment. Fiduciary alignment means your client always understands where your loyalty lies. Compensation clarity supports that alignment. A real-world discipline illustration. Imagine this chain reaction. A buyer learns after closing that their agent received a financial incentive from a builder. They claim they were pressured to close quickly. The department reviews: was the incentive disclosed? Was the disclosure timely? Did the compensation arrangement create a conflict? Was fiduciary duty maintained? If documentation shows clear disclosure and client acknowledgement, the complaint may dissolve. If documentation is vague or non-existent, enforcement risk increases. The difference is not intent. The difference is documentation and timing. How this connects to advertising and supervision, remember Chapter 3. Advertising creates visibility. Supervision creates structure. Compensation disclosure intersects with both. If you advertise free buyer representation, but receive undisclosed incentives, that may create advertising and compensation exposure. If your brokerage does not train agents on disclosure timing, supervision questions may arise. Article 7 overlaps with Article 5 and Article 11. The rule structure is intentionally interconnected. A practical compliance framework. Before entering any compensation arrangement, ask: does my client clearly understand how I am paid? Could this incentive create a perception of bias? Has disclosure been documented in writing? Would this withstand regulatory review? If your documentation tells a clear story, your risk decreases significantly. Transparency is not a burden, it is a shield. How this leads into Section 4.3. In Module 4.3, we will examine electronic records and document handling under Article 8, including how compensation disclosures must be documented and retained. Because disclosure is not just spoken, it must be documented, and in a digital compliance environment, documentation is everything.